evening from Seoul, South Korea, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joining from other time zones. Welcome to our next edition of the Integrity Talk, hosted by Independent Integrity Unit, GCF, Green Climate Fund. My name is Bayartsetseg Jigmiddash, and I'm Outreach and Engagement Manager at IIU of GCF. So I will be moderator of today's event, which will run about around 60 minutes. So for those of you who are not familiar yet with IIU, we are the independent and accountability mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. So we have three main operations. The first would be the investigations of allegations in our funded activities and also within the GCF. And secondly, we do compliance and integrity due diligence. And lastly, but not least, the capacity building, promoting awareness of GCF's integrity standards within the funded activities, also inside the GCF. So as part of our awareness operation, we host IIU's Integrity Talk. So it's our one of the branded events. In this talk series, we invite esteemed speakers, experts, practitioners from the field to share their insights and experience in the field of integrity, anti-corruption, and transparency, and also some of the aspects of the climate, its impact on climate action. So our guest speaker today, Mr. Alan Bacarese. He is a director of the investigations and strategy and operations for the World Bank Group's Integrity Vice Presidency. So we call it INT. In this role, Mr. Bacarese oversees INT's investigations of alleged fraud, corruption, and other sanctionable practice involving projects and activities financed by the World Bank Group. So he also manages INT's prevention, risk, and knowledge management function, and also prevention of fraud and corruption in World Group supported projects. So before joining INT, he was a director of integrity and anti-corruption for the African Development Bank, where he led the bank's anti-corruption investigation function and its policies on anti-corruption integrity measures, as well as bank's business integrity due diligence. So it's our pleasure to welcome Mr. Alan Bacarese as our guest speaker today. And we hope that everyone in the audience will find this discussion very insightful and engaging. And Mr. Alan, thank you for joining us today.
Not at all. Thanks, Byron. Thank you.
So let's start our discussion. So we have prepared a few questions for you. So it will be moderated the discussion for today. So let's start. Can you please briefly introduce INT's work, its mandate, and its activities for our audience, especially for those who maybe not familiar yet with INT?
Of course. Well, thanks, Barry. Well, let me first start by thanking you, and it's a very gracious invitation that you sent to me through my colleagues to come and speak on this sort of excellent initiative that you and the Climate Fund have launched. So it's a real privilege to be here, speaking to you and obviously colleagues from hopefully across the world. So thank you for the introduction. It's a great opportunity, I think, for, as you've already kindly reminded me, probably the oldest integrity function in the MDB world, probably in terms of international financial institutions as well. It is one of the oldest investigation functions. Last year, we celebrated our 20th anniversary. Like you and like many of the other MDBs and IFIs, we carry the fiduciary responsibility of the World Banks, which means, in short, that we have a responsibility to protect the assets, the funds of the bank when they are being lent through the many different complex financial instruments to support the bank's mission of reducing poverty. So it's a really important function. 20 years ago, probably like many of the listeners on the call, we were part of the audit function. I think there was an appreciation then, as there was in the African Development Bank and the ADB and others, that there was either a conflict or that it just wasn't actually working. And so for many of the MDBs and the IFIs, that function was then spun out to become a functionally independent part of the institution, and that independence is really important to the work that we do. So INT, as I say, is coming up now. Probably it's just about to celebrate its 21st birthday. We are one of the largest MDB integrity functions. We have just about 81 permanent staff within INT. We also use a number of consultants as well from various expertise background in terms of investigation, forensic audit skills, prevention skills, of course, as you sort of referred to. And I will make quite a bit of reference to our prevention function because that's the lesser, in a sense, the least well known of the functions that INT performs. INT is synonymous really with its investigations, and that's where 2/3 of my staff, which is about 100 approximately, that's where the focus is. And we have been leading in this area for, as I say, 21 years now. So 2/3 of my staff work on both external investigations. We have an internal investigation function, which deals with staff who may have become involved in fraud or corruption or collusion with vendors. So, you know, the bank obviously has a lot of vendors, as you do. And that is also an important litmus test for me at a personal level. Having been a prosecutor many years ago, eradicating internal corruption is as important as eradicating the risks that we face on some of our financing. The other third, and this I'll come to the strategy in due course when we speak a little bit more shortly, it is the prevention function. And I'm glad to be speaking to you, Byra, because obviously you're an expert in this field. This has always been important to INT. The prevention function came some time later after the creation of the investigation side, and really it came from operations. So a really mature response, I think, at that stage to understanding that the prevention aspect of the work that we do is really important. And we'll come in due course, I hope, to some questions around how we're using data to actually support prevention functions almost in real time. So I'd say about 1/3 of the team are involved in risk mitigation, the identification of risk, and they collaborate very closely actually with the investigation function. And then the prevention aspects of it. So working very closely with operations to produce lessons learned, which is part of the knowledge management part of it. But also in real time, understanding how the intelligence from complaints works and what it looks like, and allowing us to mitigate the risk. And then there is another small part of, I say small, but a hugely important part actually of INT, which is the integrity compliance part. And again, I think you just alluded, Byra, to your involvement within the fund there. And this is an evolution of how investigations have developed over this 21-year period, not just with us, but other MDBs as well. Is that there is a recognition that it's fine to sort of investigate and sanction some of these fraudulent and corrupt sort of actors, whether they're entities, companies, or individuals. But there is, again, I think an important recognition that these are difficult markets in which they operate. And we want to have some of these entities, often who have unique skills and sell unique products, to return back to these very challenging markets. So the rehabilitation of companies and individuals who are involved in the decision-making of these entities is a really important evolution of the way in which our functions have grown over the last few years. So we have a team of about 10, 12 people who are directly involved in supporting and working with those companies who have been sanctioned through the independent sanctions process. And rehabilitating them, you know, producing internationally acclaimed standards, working with the OECD and other important international actors to lay the foundations for what integrity compliance looks like. And pretty much, generally speaking, I think it's been successful. There's very few recidivist companies who re-emerge. There are some, sadly, but very few actually, so maybe surprising to some of the audience. So it's a well-established, and we know it's an important functioning part of the broad spectrum of work that we do in INT.
Yeah.
That probably gives you a bit of a flavor of who we are and what we do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quite a comprehensive overview of the INT's broad spectrum of the work in the area of anti-corruption and integrity. So as you mentioned, yes, indeed, INT, we look up to the World Bank and INT because you are indeed the longest running,
yes,
and one of the well-established and well-stopped the independent institutions among the MDBs and among the international finance institutions. And then, yeah, as you said, you celebrated 20th anniversary. It's 2 decades. It's quite a long history for the institution to be evolved and to be matured. So my next question would be, is for the INT's maturity and the growth. So what was the main strategic shifts in this past 20 years, especially in terms of the change of priorities and change of the operations and approaches, maybe new tools and new the modalities in order to address, this in this world, ever evolving integrity risks. So how this evolving process was within the INT in this past 2 decades?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a history lesson now we're about to embark upon, but I will bring us back up to date because I think it's important also to reflect where we are, and particularly I think after the recent sort of pandemic, which has really sort of sharpened our focus and arguably in some ways made us rethink some of our strategic direction. So historically, as I said, we like many of the investigation functions started in audit. There was an obvious pressure there to sort of reconsider that model. The functional independence was an important part of it. Of course, the audit function itself is independent in many MDBs, but there was an appreciation, I think, early on that had to change. I think in those early days, it was just a question of trying to create a due process structure that was fit for purpose. I think, like many MDBs and IFIs, we were building relatively small teams, often with forensic audit sort of background and expertise, rather than sort of pure investigation, dare I say, law enforcement sort of type backgrounds. And so there was an evolution to be had, and slowly but surely, the most important, I think, early commitments and changes came about through the creation of what is now the independent sanctions process, certainly in the World Bank, and it's replicated in many other institutions. We know it's tried and tested. We know it works. For those of us who are lawyers and those of us who are not lawyers, who appreciate the importance of following due process and a rule of law, it was the creation of both the investigation functions and then the oversight functions that then, in a sense, was the foundation for the sanctions process itself. There has to be an end product to an investigation, of course. And so the sanctions aspect of it, which is the deterrence part of what we do, was the early stages of that evolution. So although the due process looks slightly different across different institutions, it is broadly the same. An investigation function, there is then an oversight, which is independent from the investigations function. There's an oversight often by either fellow professionals from the same field. In the case of the AFDB, where I came from, we have very prominent jurists who come in, who exercise that oversight function. Sometimes they agree with us, sometimes they disagree. Broadly speaking, certainly my experience in the World Bank in INT is that in 89% of cases, the first part of the process, so this is the sanctions officer, generally speaking, agrees with the representations and the submissions that we make, which are obviously based on evidence. And then, of course, there is the appeal mechanism, which to any really well thought out, mature rule of law process has to exist. And the appeal process, whether it's to a panel of a combination of internal experts and external jurists, or as in the case of the World Bank, we have a panel of external jurists, some very prominent judges and lawyers, even arbiters from across the world. So that was the really important evolution that I think took place. The other significant piece of work I think that has been done by not just the World Bank, but across other MDBs was the process of sanctioning, cross-debarment, of course. You'll be aware that there is a small family of the more senior, well-established MDBs who recognize each other's debarments, so the sanctions, and reinforce them through cross-debarment, which I think is a very significant deterrent. And then the final thing I'd mention, Bayra, which I think is important here, is then the evolution of common and harmonized standards. So the way in which we define fraud, the way in which we define corruption, the way that we look at misappropriation, for example, which some of the MDBs have, obstruction, for example. These are important definitions for us to ensure that there is a harmonization that's taken place. So that is a process that still is underway. We still meet on a regular basis. In fact, we're meeting with the heads of integrity from the cross-department family next week in Colombia. And so the harmonization of common principles and definitions is really very much at the heart of what we do. So that brings me up to date. I guess really the last 3 years have shaped much of our thinking. We are all sort of immersed very much in rapid emergency sort of funding in the MDB and the IFI space. That brings its own challenges. It's absolutely quite right that we do so. A couple of years ago, for example, the bank was lending 115 billion. And so that is escalating. And just on climate last year, the World Bank was involved in financing close to 32 billion, which, and that's just on the climate side. And that was a 20%, approximately 20% increase on the previous year. And from 2019, when, of course, when our lives changed with COVID, something like an 83% increase. So the climate aspects of the financing is omnipresent in all of the financing that the World Bank is doing, particularly as it gears itself towards pretty much 100% compliance by 2025 with the Paris Agreement, and so aligning the financing within the bank with the Paris Agreement itself. So this comes with risk, of course, and this is really the challenge that we now face. And obviously, in due course, I can speak a little bit more about the changes at the moment in our strategic direction, particularly using data, new data analytics capabilities, and dare I say, artificial intelligence. These are the next challenges for us, and these are things that we're starting to embrace within INT to support actually this work that we're engaged in.
That's actually a really nice segue to my next question, the challenges. So as you mentioned, yeah, it's good thing to have, the funding and the increase in portfolio in the emergency situations, and also the climate action, because climate is really urgent, and we need the lots and lots, more climate actions in an urgent manner. However, without accountability, without the ensuring the safeguarding those the fundings and assets, it also creates another layer of problems such as anti-corruption and fraud and all sorts of issues. So with this evolving, or with this, the ever-increasing climate action, the funding scope, etc. So what are the new challenges for you, for INT, and how you tackle those the challenges in this new climate, let's say?
Yeah, I suspect the challenge that we face within INT and the World Bank Group is the challenges that many of us face across the audience that's present today. I mean, look, the reality is, and we were discussing this before we started, your next speaker, I think, may speak about sort of the human condition and the psyche, and confirm what we all know is that, fraud and corruption has been with us since humankind began, and it's not something that we will eradicate. We can certainly mitigate the risk presented by it, and we have a lot of instruments, a lot of expertise, a lot of systems and processes that have been built to sort of challenge it. So the challenge is always there. I mean, that's the reality. But this is the work that we choose to do, and that's why it's so important. I think what's changed in the last few years has, obviously, with the pandemic and the onset of the pandemic, was the speed at which emergency crises came at us in the development world, and the necessity for us to respond. With it came, obviously, the need to then disperse larger and larger amounts of financing at quicker speed. And it was a real test of the processes that exist, the checks and balances within our respective organizations. And it's not just been COVID, of course. We now have food insecurity, we have water stress, we have climate, of course, and climate is the big attendant risk that we really face now. The IPCC recently described it as deadly. We're at that deadly stage, and it's something that I know we take very seriously within the World Bank. We have been transitioning since 1995 away from fossil fuels. Back then, in 1995, the bank was already sort of working with member countries in terms of building, the policies and the legal frameworks, but also the processes to sort of move away from that. And that has to accelerate now. So how have we responded? I mean, I think COVID was a lesson in point for us. What was interesting, I think, when we continued to do the analysis as we watched our complaints within INT coming through, was how the bank was responding. Obviously, a lot of national structures were just not equipped to actually deal with the huge procurement that was necessary around vaccines, medication, around PPE equipment. And so the bank took a really novel approach of actually creating internal structures to facilitate that. So working directly with the vaccine suppliers and commercial entities to actually undertake that procurement in quick time to then sort of deliver the emergency aid that was necessary. What was interesting, I think, is that the systems held. So the 21 years of the work that we've been doing, particularly around prevention and looking and recognizing risk, mitigating risk, putting in place effectively the infrastructure to address it, worked. What was, I think, really significant for us, and working with our colleagues in operations who we have a very strong relationship with, was to see that our own internal checks and balances worked at the time. We did see, of course, as you have seen in many national jurisdictions, reports of fraud, corruption. And one of the challenges, which I think is true of climate, is the way in which some companies reinvent themselves to become experts in vaccines, experts in now climate. Some of them do so legitimately, many do not. And this is the fraud and corruption that we'll discuss in due course. So being alive, I think, to these changes and these pressures that are coming, I think is really sort of incumbent upon all of us in this space. And as I say, climate and COVID are already one aspect. And then you start to look at the fragility, the increasing fragility and conflict in many jurisdictions. There are many more, unfortunately, coming to the table. We have sort of food insecurity as well. As I said already, we have sort of crises around water and how to manage water. So we're in a precarious time, I think, frankly speaking. And this is where we have to sort of rise to this challenge. What is interesting, what is important, I think, to note is that a lot of these mature processes that have been put in place over the last 21 years are now starting to respond. They're flexing. They're having to be flexible. They're having to sort of navigate through these new challenges. But at the heart of it is fraud and corruption, which all of us recognize, and many of us have spent our careers challenging it and dealing with it. So it's an interesting combination of new pressures and old pressures sort of aligned. And I can speak in due course a little bit more about how we within INT certainly are starting to use some new innovative data and data analytics tools to sort of try and address these attendant emerging risks.
Yes, yeah, please go ahead. We would like to hear more about your new prevention operation and new tools that perhaps includes the data analytical, and then, these days hot topic, artificial intelligence. So how it's going to help us in our integrity work in the MDB IFI space.
Yeah, so I mean, data is hugely important to the World Bank. You see some of the really important analytics tools that are being developed, have been historically developed by the World Bank. The World Bank is awash with documentation. There are millions and tens of millions of documents that are, in essence, to us as the integrity function, are available to us. If you think, for example, of a large-scale dam procurement in, let's say, your corner of the world, the amount of material that is generated in terms of expressions of interest, the bidding documents, the contracts that are signed, either those that don't succeed or those that do succeed, it's a huge plethora of documentation. And the World Bank has a history going back, after the Second World War. One of the ways in which we're really changing, and I mean fundamentally changing now, this is a huge, significant next step for us, is in the ability to mine that data, to exploit it for the purposes of looking at risk. And we're very blessed within INC, within the prevention, risk and knowledge management team. We have a data lab that's housed by some wonderful individuals. And they have been very innovative in the way in which they have worked. They understand operations. In fact, the head of it comes from operations. He understands what this looks like. And now he's immersed in amongst investigators and prevention experts. And so in a sense, they have been adapting to our requirements. So the data analytics capability that we have now, all set within the framework and structure of the cloud, which allows us to sort of compute data very, very quickly in this day and age, is that we're able to absorb all of this documentation, or a large significant part of it. So the tools, the analytics tools, and this is now where AI will sort of continue to augment the powers that we're developing. We're still at the very early stages of testing it ourselves. We just had approval from our colleagues in the IT division of the World Bank to continue to test these tools. Obviously, much of what we do is strictly confidential. So I think that probably helps us building these tools, still within the framework of the World Bank, but sort of separately. And so it's allowed us to, for example, we've already started to test it with some success, is to overlay this vast lake of data and information with the materials that we have. So you can imagine with the complaints that we get, or submissions as we call them, we're going to be pushing 4,500 this year. And sort of 80% of that obviously doesn't engage our mandate, or is frivolous, or is of no relevance to us, but it still has to be looked at and it still has to be sort of processed. But, you know, even at 20%, 15, 20%, that's still a lot of material that comes to us. The intelligence that creates, the oversight, the patterns of risk is extraordinary. It's very rich as material. So you can imagine laying the complaints processes and the data and the intelligence that we get from that over the actual data provided by the procurement, for example, and other parts of operations in the bank, starts to sort of give you some idea of what the pictures are in terms of risk. We look at geographical hotspots, and the teams already are building this type of capability so that we can see in which sectors the risk is, whether it's in the water sector or in the transport sector, which jurisdictions, and what type of fraud and corruption is being alleged. And we can then start to build our risk mitigation sort of capability, that which is the prevention function course, to adapt to it. And so one example is the risk. One of the examples, is around the profiling of risk and looking at bid patterns. So we can establish already, with no complaints or allegations made, by doing this incredible analysis, to see that there are certain bids and processes of bids and structures of bids that do not lend themselves to complaints. But by using all these analytical tools and capability, we can see what the bidding patterns look like. We can also see, by overlaying data such as beneficial ownership, for example, where there is collusion between companies where nobody is going to complain. So we're in an uncharted territory here. And so this really takes us into the area of proactive investigations, which is a very, very important part of our new thinking within INC. So part of the strategy that my vice president and I sort of drafted and had approved by the board last year has a very strong component around proactive investigations, which of course is the unicorn in law enforcement circles, Bayar, as you know. But it can only be done with certainly the ingenuity, the open-mindedness of investigators to do so, but predicated on good quality data. And the existence of these tools, they're going to be flagging up for us, as I say, sort of collusive bidding processes in jurisdictions that we have no complaints from, or areas that we have no complaints from. So that's very much the way in which we're now starting to sort of adapt and sort of push in not a different direction, just a refined, a more strategic direction, I guess, than we had previously. So it's just a quick example of some of the tools that we're developing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we're very excited to hear all this new sort of strategic direction and new approach and new tools with regard to the data. Because GCF at IIU, we are one of our also the main strategic priorities, and one of the very exciting the projects that we're working on is also the proactive integrity review. And we already introduced the machine learning in our integrity risk due diligence process. So right now, GCF, we have a little over 200 projects and funded activities. So as you said, also going through all this accumulated data and the project documents, it's quite extensive, but we have introduced this new integrity due diligence platform with the machine learning tool. So it goes through, it's very smart, and as a lawyer, I mean, it's for me, it still takes time to understand and comprehend the full magic of it. But it's really the brilliant that it goes through and sifts through all the documents and it rates without the human judgment, without human bias, rates and assess the red flags and integrity risk and project activities. And then we can proceed with the human involved integrity reviews in some of the project funded activities. So here we're very proud of this new tool that we have developed, and we already start to share this experience with other MDBs and with our other communities. And in fact, last week or so, or 2 weeks ago, with OECD Integrity Forum, we had our special side events exclusively on the machine learning and integrity project. So we're happy to share our experience with you. So if you have the data lab already established, it's always opportunity to share, cross-share.
I think well, it's so important. It's great to hear that is taking place. Sadly, I wasn't in Paris last week, but I know one of the team was. And in the forthcoming big anti-corruption event that we have in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire in 2 weeks' time, I know we'll be meeting some of your colleagues there. We're happy to share, the experiences so far. We've just presented a technical briefing to our board of directors, the audit committee, who we have a dotted reporting line to, and they were really sort of fascinated by the scale of what can be achieved. I mean, it's still very much in its early stages, but those early tests are already starting to sort of yield results. And the point you make, I mean, it's important to emphasize as well that this still requires the human eye. It still requires a level of expertise and judgment from investigators and prevention colleagues that we cannot eradicate. This is about assisting that process. The human eye cannot, unless they spend months and months doing it, look through all of this vast lake of documentation. So this is about efficiencies and allowing us to do our jobs better. The other point I should have made, actually, Barry, if I may, is returning back to the confluence between investigation and prevention. To us, that's a really important part of the work that we're developing, and very much it's central to the strategy that we're now working through for these next 2 years. Is the ability to have our prevention experts, again, steeped in operations. They know operations in a way that investigators don't, sitting side by side and reviewing these hundreds and hundreds of complaints. These are active complaints that we look at on a weekly basis. So it's interesting sort of chairing with the head of our intake function, looking at those the submissions that are relevant for us to look at. So we have senior investigators steeped in this fraud and corruption, sitting side by side with prevention expertise, and the quality of the conversation, the debate is extraordinary. They historically would not have sat and looked at complaints coming in, but it's the value add that they add to this process, because they can see risk and they can almost immediately start to think about the mitigation of risk as the complaints are being assessed for the possibility of opening up an actionable complaint, or eventually an investigation. And so when I spoke previously about real-time support from prevention, it means that they are able immediately to sort of then pick up the phone and speak to the TTLs, the project leads, the procurement experts, the financial management experts, who they know, of course, through their work across the bank, and then start to say, look, this is a risk that we're seeing. Let's look at it. Let's look at it in more detail. Obviously, subject to some of the confidentiality that comes from some of these complaints, but pretty much, they're able to sort of pick that up in real time and then work to actually support the project. It depends where the project is in terms of its cycle. If it's in the early stages of procurement, and I have a couple of examples here, we can actually then stop the process or inject a level of oversight that actually supports our fiduciary sort of obligations. So I think that's a really important part of the strategic direction in which we've changed. I think it's an incredibly value add to have our prevention colleagues are sent there with us. So,
Yes.
my apologies, my good email's going through now.
Yeah, that's okay.
And I can't switch this on.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Thanks again for emphasizing the prevention mandates and then the new tools and new strategies that is not only applicable to you, but also overall in our community.
Yes.
So I would like to move to our next question, which is the bread and butter of the INT in all our work, the investigations.
Yes.
So, I would like to ask the investigations in terms of how you bring accountability through investigation, so that investigation is not like one of siloed investigation, the conduct, but it actually prevents from the future the bigger other corrupt practices or the bigger integrity, the risks. And we know, INT over the course of 2 decades, you have investigated big, high-profile investigation cases involving the big-name multinational corporates and companies, and that worth of hundreds of millions of dollars. So can you please also share some of your examples of the cases that sort of brought you and set the precedent and brought bigger strategic directions, or brought some brought a bigger, let's say, impact.
Yes, so well, impact is the word. I think that's exactly what we're striving to achieve. Look, I mean, this is the direction in which we have been going for the last 21 years. It's about having deterrence in place, creating risk for those companies and those individuals controlling those companies who are tempted to pay the bribes, who are tempted to enter into collusive relationships either with other companies or with members of a public administration to win contracts. This is what the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is about, and this is very much the foundation of what the UN Convention Against Corruption was about as well. So the international sort of framework and architecture, the legal aspects of it is there. So deterrence is a huge part of it, and Barry, you've alluded already to some of these major investigations. They still continue. We recently debarred a very, very large corporation from your part of the world. That was a sanction that was announced in December. There are still a pipeline of some very, very large companies who, for obvious reasons, I can't sort of name today. And so impact is what it's about. We could continue to do small frauds on a daily basis, and we wouldn't achieve that. It's about trying to mitigate and minimize the risk, particularly in this growing area of fragile and conflict states. And the numbers are growing, which means that the people who are subjected to this fragility in this conflict is increasing, which means, of course, poverty is increasing. So the deterrence aspect of the investigations is still, it's primary, in a sense, DNA, and that's why the sanction system exists. But for me, it's that complement of prevention, which I think is really important, to understand what that risk is in a time frame that it does not run parallel with the process of investigation, because we're talking about 2, sometimes maybe even 3 years, particularly for the really large, impactful cases, to actually go through a formal process of investigation, and then also through the sanctions, independent sanction system itself. To me, the much more important strategic direction going forwards is to have that complement of prevention. So looking at the risk, identifying the risk, and then continue to mitigate it. And I think, going back to how we started the conversation, the other really important part of it's the flip side to deterrence, is rehabilitation. And if you were in Paris, as some of our colleagues on the screen maybe were in Paris last year, you'll have seen a lot of work by some wonderful experts speaking about integrity compliance. So this ability to rehabilitate these companies, to subject them to these international standards, which of course the World Bank, with the OECD, the UN and others has led on for a long time now. And to get these companies to comply with these international standards of integrity compliance, to engage in collective action initiatives so that they can actually then sort of mentor some of the smaller SMEs And we know in Africa, for example, the SMEs are actually sort of 80, nearly 90% of the economic activity, the commercial activity on the continent. So whilst we can talk about these very large entities that historically we have sanctioned, that other MDBs have sanctioned, that's important. There's no doubt about it. But it's actually getting the message down to some of these smaller entities and SMEs in particular. So I think that's threefold aspects of investigations complemented by insightful, well-informed, strategically positioned prevention and risk mitigation functions. And then where there have been sanctions, where deterrence is starting to work, is the rehabilitation so that these companies can come back into the market and to almost inspire others to know that you can win these contracts through legitimate processes. So I think that's a really sort of important aspect of the work that we do.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's investigation and complemented by the prevention, like full cycle of the operations, indeed crucial in this type of integrity work. So now let's move to the subject of partnership. Mm-hmm. So we know in our community and in our work, doing alone business is difficult. The work requires a lot of partnership and collaboration across the sector, across the different levels, and across the community. So can you please elaborate on INT's approach in terms of how you work with the national government at the national level? Yeah. And most importantly, how you work with the law enforcement agencies at the national level? Because in our investigation work, the crucial aspect is collaboration and partnership, and some sort of good working relationship with the law enforcement agencies at the national level when we conduct either joint or the own investigations. And also, please share your work or new strategic directions in terms of partnership with the civil society and civil society engagement in
yes.
Maybe the prevention and some other aspects of the work.
Of course. Actually, if I may, I'll start with civil society first, actually, because I've had in my fortunate, lucky career, I've also spent time, working with civil society. I spent 4 years working with the Basel Institute on Governance in Switzerland, where we built almost a law enforcement capability on recovering the proceeds of fraud and corruption, particularly for victim countries, which is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And they are very active in the space of collective action. So there's an integrity compliance function within the Basel Institute as well. So civil society is critical in this equation. So the existence and promotion. My apologies. The existence and promotion, I think, of civil society is central to the fight against corruption. Where we have that greater sort of visibility, so we have, and we've seen some wonderful examples over the last sort of 5-10 years with the Panama Papers, some of the HSBC leaks, for example, some incredible investigative journalism, which wasn't around 20 years ago, particularly in this space. I think maybe in the political space it was. So, the existence of civil society investigative journalists is important because that's the scrutiny at a national level that most of us do not enjoy. And so being able to sort of work with them, support them, and in the forthcoming meeting that we have in Côte d'Ivoire and Abidjan, we have an important sort of section celebrating the work of civil society, and many of them from across Africa, but across the world will be present to sort of tell their stories. This is where our complaints come from the analysis that we do on our submissions, complaints to INT. We actively look to try and encourage the participation of civil society, both in terms of having that oversight and being able to make those complaints to a process and a structure that will take it seriously and professionally. But also playing, and this is with the World Bank through its governance practice, as is the case in other MDBs, supporting civil society to build the institutions in those jurisdictions that will ensure that there's resilience and legacy. So civil society very much at the heart of very much what we do, and to exclude them, I think, is a huge mistake. I'm very glad that certainly we're able to sort of work with them. And in some jurisdictions, you can see the power of it because of the nature of complaints and the quality actually of what we get. So coming back to the question about building partnerships, again, this is critical. We can all work in our isolated bubbles and think that we're making a contribution, but it's the power, it's the collective power of the MDBs. And you can see that with the cross-debarments arrangement, for example, that the power that comes from the World Bank debarring a company for 3 years with conditional release, which means they have to go through the rehabilitation process, but that is immediately cross-debarred by the other members of the cross-debarment arrangement. For those companies who have an economic model that is predicated on development finance, that's a very, very significant blow to know that you can't work for the World Bank, but you also can't work for the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, EBRD in London, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Inter-American Development Bank. That's a lot of markets that have gone immediately because of your sanctionable misbehavior. So having the networks and placing people within this framework, this structure is hugely important. Within INT, we discussed this at the outset. We have increasing large amounts of MOUs. We're currently hoping to sign one with you and your office, Vera, and we have somewhere between 50 and 60 of these MOUs. We'll be signing a few more new ones when we get to Abidjan with other countries who want to collaborate with us. They create legal frameworks that make it easier, sometimes for them, sometimes for us, although it's not absolutely critical to have an MOU that will support the exchanges of information, of intelligence, and also support us when we look to actually work with them more on the investigation side. So that's again, a fundamentally important aspect of the work that we do. I'm still, even to this day, surprised, like you, I have colleagues and old friends in legal practice who tell me that actually very few people know about the investigation function and the sanctioning that comes from the MDB investigations, which still surprises me. So there's still more work for us to be done in terms of broader education to the legal markets, to general counsels in particular, who work in these large entities. So that is an ongoing commitment that we have to sort of rise to. And then coming back to the really important question that you've asked is around working with national authorities and particularly law enforcement. The challenge that we face within MDB investigations and IFI investigations is that we cannot complete the full circle of fraud and corruption, which means that the demand side, which regrettably means often public officials, senior powerful people within administrations and governments who are involved, whether they're extorting the bribes or whether they're simply a party to a collusive corrupt relationship, they are beyond our own jurisdiction, unless they are being paid as consultants by the World Bank, which actually surprisingly happens on occasions. So this is an incomplete circle. And in terms of having this holistic approach to battling international fraud and corruption, we have to sort of engage on that aspect of it. And that then lies with the national jurisdictions. I mean, that's where the power, the legal power and the mandate to investigate those people lies. So INC has always historically had, and certainly now, we've increased the strategic thinking around it, looking at risk, has always had a program of referrals. And by referrals, I mean that we are prepared to notify national authorities, law enforcement authorities, usually through the Ministry of Finance, which is obviously our main counterpart within the member states, of our suspicion that the national law may have been broken. So a bribe has been demanded by a public official, for example, beyond our jurisdiction, but definitely not beyond the jurisdiction of the law enforcement in that country itself. And so this process of referral is something we're spending a lot of time looking at very, very carefully. Some of you will probably, the best known example is the case of SNC-Lavalin in Canada, where INC historically provided some material as part of this referral process. Initially, it's an engagement process. We send letters inviting people to come to us if they're interested in working with us. We don't conduct joint investigations. We can conduct parallel investigations, but not joint investigations. But we are happy to support these law enforcement as much as we can within the confines of our own confidentiality and privileges and immunities. And so in SNC, of course, in the investigations in Canada into the company, which was investigated and debarred by both the World Bank and subsequently the African Development Bank, some of that material was then used for the purposes of commencing a criminal investigation. And that criminal investigation was challenged through the courts, ultimately to the Supreme Court of Canada, which agreed that the World Bank was correct in being able to provide that material to law enforcement. So it was a challenging time, I guess, for my colleagues who were working in INC at that time. But it really exemplified the value of this referral process, and it was very supportive of the process itself. And so this is really in many ways our foundation. It's that historical legacy that gives us a reassurance that we can, through our legal teams in the bank, work to support and to provide certain types of materials to law enforcement for them to effectively trigger an investigation. We are not simply going to hand over the entirety of our investigation itself, because of course there are certain confidentialities that attach to that process and that documentation. But in many jurisdictions, and we've seen it in one European jurisdiction at the moment, we're seeing it also in another jurisdiction in Western Europe, where our referrals are the platforms, are the point of instigation for criminal investigations against those public officials who are involved in the demand side. So, this is talking about strategic directions and how things are changing. Maya, that's the question that you asked. This is very much, if not at the heart of what we're trying to achieve, a really important part of the equation for us going forwards. And we will continue this theme when we see our colleagues in Abidjan, and we meet some of the law enforcement agencies who are supporting victim countries, because they face incredible challenges, both legally, logistically, in terms of resources. So these abilities to work with international law enforcement, I think, is really an important part of the work that we're doing.
Indeed, it's very important aspect, and thank you for your insights and your experience on this important aspect that is, I think, applicable to all of us in our community. So that's the end of my the prepared questions, and thanks again for your very extensive and comprehensive overview of the INT's work, strategic directions, and some of the challenges in your insights. So we're now ready to take questions from our audience. So please type your questions in the chat, so we will do best to answer as many as possible to your questions. So please don't be shy. In your chat box, please type up your questions, and I hope Alan will answer those questions. And indeed, you provide such an extensive and comprehensive overview that perhaps we felt like
I may have answered all the questions that they may have had.
No room to ask questions. But
yes.
Can we see the chat box here? Let's open up. Oh yeah, I can see.
Your shy audience, as you say.
Yeah. Yes. So while our participants, the audience, warming up and preparing and typing their questions, just a quick question from you, Alan, as a personal, as an individual. So what keeps you busy these days? What keeps you awake? What worries you these days?
Well, at the moment, there are two things that are keeping me incredibly busy. One is the preparation for the big events, the anti-corruption, INT's well, it's the World Bank that is INT's, and that really runs the show, is the International Corruption Hunters Alliance meeting, which historically was hosted every 2 years, and historically, largely, it was hosted in DC. There were, I think, on the last occasion, 2018, it was hosted with the Danish government in Copenhagen. So on this occasion, the Vice President and I, we decided that we would take it back to where its origins in many ways, which was to Africa, and Western Africa in particular. I think the Francophone countries have been ignored in the past, sadly, and yet there are challenges, obviously, that they face. So that event, with over 300 people attending so far, somewhere in excess of 60 wonderful international speakers and experts in this area, talking about investigations, talking about international cooperation, talking about fraud and corruption risks in fragile, conflict, violent states, talking about integrity, compliance, and prevention. So that's one, and the other is I also am a co-author on the UK's textbook on corruption and misconduct in public office. Yeah, so we're now starting to finalise the 4th edition. It's published by Oxford University Press. I don't advise you buy a copy. It's incredibly expensive. I can't afford it myself, and yet I co-authored the thing. But that's a huge amount of work. Knowing that you have your peers reading and potentially criticising your work is extraordinarily stressful in some ways, and so I'm currently sort of drafting quite a bit of chapters at the moment. So those two things are keeping very, very busy, on top of looking after all our wonderful colleagues within INT and making sure that they have the resources that they need to continue to implement our mandate.
That's so incredible that you have this intellectual work on top of all this the big portfolio and the daily work, and that's very commendable.
It doesn't feel very intellectual at 11 o'clock at night, and I'm really struggling to think so. But thank you for the compliments. I know what you mean.
And also thank you for invitation to IIU for the upcoming conference that keeps you awake in these days. And
yes.
We're very privileged and honored to be invited. Our deputy head, Albert Halaha, was invited and participated as a keynote speaker for the conference. So
wonderful.
We're very privileged and honored to share our side of stories and experience, and also the machine learning and data tools and stuff. So
absolutely,
thank you for the invitation.
So
we see questions in the chat. Maybe. Okay, so we have 3 questions in the chat. So first question. Where do you see yourself professionally in the next 5 years? Aside from a book and big conference and INT.
That's a good question, isn't it? I would sincerely hope still with INT. I've been lucky to have a long career. I've worked in many different countries. I think this is my 5th country that I've lived in. The US, of course, I'm talking about now, because we're based in Washington, DC. I would still very much hope working here with INT. There's still a lot to do. There's some wonderful colleagues here. And I know that we can deliver on all of the other mandates, and whatever new strategic ideas that myself and the Vice President have, or the new incoming President, of course, to the World Bank may have, I know that they're up for the challenge. And so this is one of the pleasures of working with such a professional sort of team of experts. So that's where I would hope to be. At some point, I would like to visit Seoul. I've never been to Korea, so I must tick that off.
Yeah, please come to this side of the world and see the boomings of the Asia and Korea.
Yes.
So now let's move to the next 2 questions, and then we will wrap up. So thank you, Alan, for this informative presentation. Regarding your analytics capacity, would you please elaborate on your machine learning and AI implementation roadmap? Maybe discuss how the models were trained and the questions you are hoping to get answered.
Now, that's a very good question, and I'm probably not going to do a very good job of answering this, because this is now beyond my sort of level of capability. I know what I wanted to do, because this is the whole thing about new technology, is ensuring that it's responding to the needs of the customer, I guess. We're still at the very early stages, Albert. I mean, it's a very good question. Thank you. We can discuss more when hopefully we meet soon. So we have a sort of 7-point strategy going into the next 2 years. It's taken us already nearly 2 years just to get the accreditation to run a lot of these new tools that we're starting to bring together. So we're very much at that sort of nascent, sort of early part of the process. Like all AI, it's predicated on quality data, volumes of data, which we clearly have in the World Bank, and then the quality of data. And so we're refining much of our own internal processes, particularly around the intelligence gathering that we do on mining our own complaints, let's say 4,500 a year approximately. That's a lot of material. And so ensuring that that it's being logged properly and so that the data is then in its best shape so that we can then feed it into the data lake that is the foundation for a lot of the AI that will come. But one very early AI tool that we'll be testing is translation capability. So AI will, as a functionality, as an app that our colleagues will be able to deploy in country, somewhere in excess of 100 languages already available to us, we'll be able to undertake the translation immediately, within seconds. So they can feed through a very large comprehensive document that's in, you can imagine the sorts of languages that we're talking about. And then there's an immediate sort of response to it. So this is a capability that's beyond the current and the current commercial tools, because it is immersed in the INT data lake. It is, you know, obviously better informed. It's much sharper, responding to some of the technical sort of language that we're likely to use. So that in itself is already an efficiency saving for translation in the many tens of thousands a year. But it's the ability to be able to respond in real time. And in terms of the challenges, well, the challenges in many ways is time, the constantly evolving nature of some of these data capabilities and data and analytics tools, and also AI itself. We're also very cognizant of the ethical aspects of AI, and that's something that the head of the data team and ourselves as managers, senior managers, discuss on a fairly frequent basis. The ability for AI to produce skewed responses, unethical responses, is actually a really important part of how we work and navigate through these current sort of, I mean, wonderful challenges for us, but nevertheless, that's an important part of it. So I'm not sure I've really answered Albert's question, but I can certainly put him in touch with our data leads to respond.
It will be continued in a different platform. So the next question is, what are some things that regular people or people working in the climate field can do help prevent corruption in the climate work happening in our own countries?
Yes, so in many ways, the climate is new and not new. The risks that we continue to face on climate financing is the old risk that we faced on misrepresentation of qualifications, which is one of the examples that I had. Fraudulent misrepresentations to gather subsidies. There was one case that we had from one of the Pacific Islands where a company had fraudulently misrepresented data around subsidies to gather more money from the financing. So it's the old risks of fraud and corruption. It's understanding what fraud and corruption is, what it looks like, and how it manifests itself in procurement processes, bidding processes, in the collusive relationships that exist between companies and public officials, for example. So it's actually still continuing to sharpen up the skills that currently exist, the oversight through civil society, through investigative journalists. The fact it's climate is particularly egregious because of the current, as I said, referred to the IPCC earlier, the deadly risks that we face. So I would hope that, you know, continued vigilance on fraud and corruption in all its manifestations is the key here. So engaging with civil society, as I say, investigative journalists and citizens, just simply sort of looking and asking those difficult questions. Understanding, you know, how these processes work, I think, is already one of the important challenges that they face. But using, you know, current open source available information, there's more and more of it out there with the internet, the embed of some of these wonderful tools. So it's vigilance on traditional fraud and corruption is the absolute platform that will support us.
Yeah, thank you. And then there are two more questions, and we will wrap up.
Yes, sure.
So the next question is, can you please a little bit on this highly interesting area of rehabilitating companies that have been previously sanctioned?
Yes, no, thanks. It's a good question. So thanks for that. And the integrity compliance part of INT, and it's true of many other MDBs, as I say, is the importance of a supplement and a mature response to the fact that we need these entities, many of them back into these difficult commercial markets. So the compliance standards are now set. You can find compliance, the integrity compliance standards on all of the MDB websites. The harmonized versions of it exist both on the ADB's websites as it does on the World Bank INT websites, as it does with the OECD as well. What we talk about when we talk about compliance, we're talking about minimum standards in terms of having in place risk mitigation, sort of identification and mitigation measures, ensuring that you have in place corporate standards around gifts, the acceptance of gifts, non-payment of bribes, for example, regular but important strategically nuanced training, depending on the different environment in which you're operating, for training staff, the declaration of use of agents, for example, which is always a particular sort of risky sort of endeavor. Working with the agents to ensure that they are abiding by international minimum standards of corporate compliance. So there's a whole raft of measures. I mean, we could go into it more if we had more time, but they are these international standards, and they are harmonized across most of the MDBs and IFIs. You can find them online, but you can see a whole host of these. And the companies often will not be released from sanction because it's a conditionality of their release until they have complied to the satisfaction of, in our case, the integrity compliance officer and her team. So it's a very rigorous standard. It is designed to be rigorous, and it's designed really to ensure that they return back into the marketplace as companies of integrity that are going to respect the rules and contribute to the broader sort of support and fight against corruption.
Thank you. And last quick question, sorry that we take up so much time.
Yeah, sure. No, that's sure.
So to answer all the questions that from the audience. So what will be the most effective approach to gain support and acceptance for the implementing innovative technologies such as AI or chat GPT in our daily work within the domain?
Yes.
It's such a hot topic these days, huh?
It is. And again, it's a good question. The first thing is, I mean, I think it's critically important with these really innovative new tools that are flying at us on a daily basis, is to ensure that you have some of the internal capability and expertise to understand what this means. The second thing is that it's got to work for whatever your functionality is, whether it's the investigation side, the prevention side. It is a tool that makes us as humans more effective, and that's the important thing to remember. It's not a means and an end to itself. It is there to support us. And as I said to you, Byra, already, you know, that instinct, that professional judgment of 20, 30, 40 years of experience will not disappear overnight. And it's really a complement to that sort of thinking. The other thing I would mention, I think it was Matt who asked the question, is to also take along with you those that you report to. So we've done a couple of technical briefings to one of our very senior managers within the World Bank in the last 2 weeks. We also did it to the audit committee. In fact, they wanted to hear about some of the capability and work that we were doing with data analytics and AI and forensics. And so that's a really important part of the equation, is to take senior management with you, to let them know what it is that you're trying to achieve, how it's going to make you more effective, because of course the issue of resources and budget alignment is always central to these conversations. But ultimately for me, it's ensuring that our tech guys know that this is a complement to what we do, and so it becomes very, very fungible and very flexible and innovative all at the same time. So that's what I would say.
Indeed, these new tools, it's meant to aid us, not to replace us. Huh?
Yes.
Humans.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. So thank you again for sharing your insights in such a wonderful and comprehensive and extensive overview of IINT and all these new tools and cases. It was very insightful and very engaging discussion. So we'll give you a floor if you have last comments or reflection on the topic. The floor is for you. So
Thanks, Bayo. Well, just to thank you again. Thank you for being such a gracious, eloquent host as well. Thank you for your questions. Thanks to your colleagues on screen for their questions as well. No, just to appreciate that these networks that we build between you, ourselves, the Global Fund, and the Climate Fund, and others is, I think, critically important to advancing this conversation. So we very much look forward to seeing you again and to see Albert actually in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire shortly, to continue this conversation and sharing, the knowledge that we're gathering, and very, very quickly at the moment to sort of improve our responses to, the risks that we continue to face going forwards. So, no, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today. And we hope you found this discussion valuable and informative. So be sure that you join us our future integrity talks. So stay tuned, our IIU's integrity talk, and also many other IIU organized also events. So thank you again.